Cliff. Hello, Betsy. Hello, Sylvia.
Hello, Lisa.
Nice to see you all.
You can start, Betsy.
Okay, I'm gonna. Are you back, Cliff? Sorry. Are you back in San Miguel, Cliff?
Yes, yes, we are here.
Okay. See you soon.
Need to get together.
Exactly. I'm gonna.
Ask Roberto if we're live yet. Ask Roberto if we're live.
Roberto. Don't you?
Yeah, I told you, Betsy, it's already online. You can start now.
Hello, I'm Betsy Bowman, the host for today's Global Justice Report. Welcome. We want to welcome everyone who's on our YouTube channel or in our Zoom room. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational bilingual research center in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering the social and solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we have, of course, discontinued our in-person events and instituted online webinars, as so many other organizations have done. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and be able to continue to pay our staff. You can donate at our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. And today's program is, I forget which webinar this is, but we've been doing this since last fall. We are extraordinarily fortunate to have today as our speaker, Sylvia Federici, who is a professor emerita from Hofstra University. She will speak on COVID, women's work, and the crisis of social reproduction. Sylvia is the preeminent scholar of the role of women's unpaid caregiving work in the rise and dominance of capitalism. She chronicles this in her groundbreaking work, Caliban and the Witch, which I encourage everyone to read at least once, if not twice. The COVID pandemic has underscored how women have borne the brunt of the crushing burden of their unpaid labor educating children at home, while at the same time trying to do their paid jobs at home or having to leave their paid job to stay with their children at home while the children are supposedly going to school. At least since the beginning of capitalism in the 15th century, women have borne the burden of doing all the work of caregiving and reproducing everyday life. And capital accumulation could never have dominated us as it has without all of this labor being unpaid, unseen, ignored. It's not counted in GDP. It's not counted as part of the economy. All of this work that we as women know we all do, and that the men who are watching either help participate with or who benefit from. Women who strayed from this role over history, of course, there have been women such as nuns or midwives or scholars or lesbians. These women have often been punished as witches. We know that quite well from European history. Today, Federici will focus on this enormous burden that women have suffered, continuing their caregiving roles, helping with the virtual education of their children at home, while also doing their paid job. This burden has increased with the silent epidemic of physical abuse against women and children and femicides. The emotional stress of these triple burdens impacts women and children for generations, as all trauma affects people for generations. And as war has impacted societies for generations. I'll stop there and turn it over to Sylvia. And thank you so much for taking the time today, Sylvia, to help us understand why we're all under so much stress and going through such hardships during this pandemic. Sylvia, please.
Okay, I having a difficulty unblocking seeing you all, but you can hear me, right? You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Good. Thank you.
There we
Thank
go.
you, Betsy, and thank you all, Cliff and Rob. Bob, it's a great pleasure to be here with you, and I'm sorry that I cannot be in San Miguel with you all at the Global Justice Center. Yes, no, the crisis that we are living today with the COVID, has really dramatized a much older and deeper crisis that I think has developed through the history and characterized the whole history of capitalist society. And it's the crisis that is rooted in the capitalist systematic devaluation of human life, which is expressed and demonstrated in the devaluation of the most important activity that reproduce, our daily life, beginning with the work which in capitalism has become specifically women's work, because much reproductive work, not all, but a great part of reproductive work in the past in pre-capitalist society, for example, subsistence agriculture, which is part of the daily reproduction of life, was also shared with men, with children. With capitalism, in fact, it becomes the division, the sexual division of labor becomes very much accentuated, and the whole sphere of reproductive activity, becomes, in a sense, falls into a big black hole, becomes invisible, becomes unpaid labor, becomes women's labor, and it's treated, as a natural resources. Capitalism has looked at women's work, at reproductive work, which has many, many, many sides to it, many aspects to it. It's not only procreation and child raising and the care of the sick, it's the cooking, the cleaning, the showing, the emotional work, the sexual work. So it's a work that in fact has no end, but has been treated as a natural resource. And in fact, we are celebrated once a year, Mother's Day, celebrate Mother's Day and ignore for the rest of the year. It's very interesting. The devaluation of domestic work has been so systematic, so extreme, that even when this work has been done for pay, it has not been recognized as work. For instance, in the United States, all the labor legislation, until very recently, all labor legislation have excluded systematically paid domestic work, which was mostly done by Black women, the continuation, the history of slavery. And domestic workers were considered companion, were classified as companion, not seen as worker. And in fact, domestic work for pay has always been, until now, one of the lowest paid work, and one, of course, of the jobs that exposes the worker to the maximum of abuse, because it's a one-to-one contract. So we are speaking of a crisis. In order to understand, the crisis that COVID has opened up in social reproduction, and particularly in the life of women. We have to go through a long journey, and that journey becomes even more, dramatically perverse, in the late 70s, early 1980s, when, as a consequence, as a result of the massive mobilization of women across the world, right, to basically not to be confined to domestic work, to gain some economic autonomy, to be able to enter and participate in, job activity, employment activity traditionally reserved for men, right? And you begin to see there is a, substantial migration, of women into the wage labor force. And this, however, is exactly the moment, in which in Europe, in the US, and slowly, across the world, any form of investment, any form of support, subsidies, to reproductive activity on the side of government has been systematically curtailed. For a number of years, for instance, I've studied the yearly budget of the United States, and I can say that assistance to funding of senior center, child care centers, and so on, have been the first services on the chopping block. These are the ones that have been systematically underfunded, undermined, so that in fact, for women working outside the home has been really not at all a form of, not to mention liberation, but even a means to acquire some economic autonomy. It is very interesting and very significant, for instance, and I think it's important to look at this detail, that in the United States, those who have the largest amounts of debt, are usually women who have jobs outside the home, because the jobs, the form of employment that they have access to are usually underpaid. And then the cost of working, if you have children, now you have to pay for daycare. The daycare that used to be state supported is not there any longer. Assistance to the elderly, those who are not self-sufficient. For instance, in many, many cases in the US, used to be that you had social workers going to the house of elderly who did not want to be institutionalized and needed some help. But now the same social worker, instead of having 5, 6 persons in the morning to cater to, now they may have 15. And of course, it's impossible, right? So there's been a continuous erosion of the state investment, into the reproduction, particularly of the workforce. Because clearly it's important to stress that the work that the majority of women do in the home, is not work that, benefits only the member of their families, reproduces the member of their family, but most importantly, actually reproduces the workforce. And I think this is something very, very important. We are speaking about the fact that for generation now, you have a capitalist class who has saved trillions at the expense of women, because they have been able to benefit of the work of the energy, the new energies every day of workers, of millions of workers, without having really to invest, in the process of their reproduction. So that we actually have been speaking of the community, of the home, the family as production places, as the hidden part of the assembly line. But that hidden part, which is perhaps the most important, because it is the support work of every other kind of activity. Without the production of worker, there is no other kind of production, right? And nevertheless, the moment in which women manage to have access to some other form of employment, and assert the need to not to have to depend on a man for their survival, with all the implications, right? The domestic violence in the family has always existed and has always had a financial basis as well. Because if you are dependent on the men, particularly when you have children, for their survival, you cannot walk out of the door, when the man abuses you. So in fact, a domestic violence has always been, the support system, of the nuclear family, of the kind of work. And you can say that the state has delegated to men the power to supervise women's work of reproduction, and has also given them the authority to punish them physically with abuse, when they have not complied with their work. Now, so the situation that we are describing today with COVID, the crisis that COVID has opened up, the crisis that the COVID has opened. Okay. Sorry for these interruptions. The crisis that COVID has opened up, it's a crisis that deepens and dramatizes, a crisis that is structural, that is not new, only brings it to the surface. Because of course, with the epidemics, what a situation has been, of daily tension, the situation has been of women trying to juggle between outside employment and family, reproduction work obligation, which already has a deep effect on their lives. Even before COVID, over the last 15 years, the life expectancy of women here in the United States has declined of 5 years. And not only that, as I've often underlined, women have been the biggest consumer of antidepressants, right? They have been really pushing by day, by taking pills and fighting, because they have been living a life all consumed by work, without time really for regeneration. Now, I'm not talking about, a minority of women for whom the access to other kind of employment has opened up new possibilities. At the same time, it will be important to see what are these new work, because many times the work that are celebrated as being more creative are also jobs that give you more power on other women, right? They give you more power, on to control the life of other people or other women. So now we come to COVID. COVID, the disasters, the mortality that COVID has produced could have been completely anticipated. First of all, since the late 70s, hand in hand with the expansion of capitalist relations across the world, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, we have seen a constant epidemic, right? Millions of people have died. In Africa alone, epidemics of cholera, meningitis, Ebola, and then Zika, and then avian flu, and etc. Now, they have never attracted attention the way COVID has attracted, because they have been confined to former colonial countries of, terrain of American imperial expansion. And so in many ways, the media look at these people as somewhat dispensable. But in fact, the history of the restructuring of the global economy and the expansion of neoliberal forms of capitalism has been a history of epidemics. And it's not a surprise, that now we have COVID, and we are told that COVID is not the end. The COVID is here to stay, and many others will also take place. So this has got to be a turning point. It's got to be a turning point to beginning to reflect what is to be done, because we are facing a crisis of social reproduction, which has preceded COVID, but now it's taken on very dramatic proportion. And at the center of this crisis, it's women. And here we know now, for instance, that in the United States, the figures are fluid, but some speak of 5 million women who have lost wage employment, partially because the jobs that they had have shut down, and partially because they voluntarily, so to speak, had to leave them because the school closed down and the daycare closed down, and they had to care for their children, right? So we are talking about a massive return of women, into the home, and in condition even more dramatic, because now you have to deal with, the domestic work. You have to deal with many cases with Zoom. Those who are lucky not to have to go out, those who don't have the essential jobs and have to go out to work no matter what, and also have to deal with the children. And deal with the children means not only help them with the internet, help them with the trauma, with all the emotional work, that being separated from other children, being separated from the school, etc. provokes, right? So we hear now every day that the home now is a center, of major, where women are exploding, because they have a load of work and preoccupation and worries, and that is eating their lives. And where next, and before we go there though, those who are even more severely affected have been paid domestic workers, right? Mostly migrant women coming from Africa, from the Caribbean island, from the Philippines, and these are women, many of them have been laid off because the family did not trust their presence because they were afraid of infection, or could no longer pay them. It's not clear how many of them are going to be rehired, once the threat eases up, right? And these women are affected not only directly on their own lives, but they're also affected because families at home are depending on them. So the crisis, it's really immense. And I think it requires a broader thinking. And we really need to be critical of the restrictive ways, right? Not surprising, however, the very restrictive ways in which they are being addressed at the institutional level. We are told now by President Biden, even though it's not even clear what he's proposing, in his big infrastructure proposal, investment proposal, right, that some monies, some billions will go to boost the care economy, right? And what that will mean is not clear, because we know that he has rejected, for example, the bill does not include an increase in the minimum wage, to $15 an hour. So the question of actually increasing the pay for care workers, seems to be now very much in question. It seems that much of the work, much of the investment will go for the construction of new daycare and for the restructuring of those who are already existing. What does it mean in terms of making them available at a very, very cheap cost for family, or at no cost for working class family, which is really what would be most needed? That I doubt very much that is in the card. But even that, and of course that would be a revolutionary step if women could have access, to free daycare. But even that will not be enough. First of all, free daycare is not all. We are also talking about the care for the elderly. There are now millions and millions of elderly who are living a really terrible life. We have seen what has happened, what has taken place, in the nursing home. The fact that the nursing home, that too, the high mortality of the nursing home, that too was a crisis that could be completely anticipated. Because publicly funded nursing home have been a scandal, a place of crisis now for many years. I've done work on it. I've done some research. And not only they've been constantly underfunded, but so much the personnel has been cut that the level of abuse, the level of mistreatment, we're talking about older people, allowed to stay hours and hours in bed, drugged up, so they do not create any problem, drugged up, staying in their excrement, with bed sores. We're talking about people being abused, often by staff who is overworked and dehumanized. Dehumanized. I understand that in many cases, some of the abuses have to do from the fact that people are very much at the end of their rope psychologically, living, working in conditions in which they cannot do this type of job. And so the high mortality was not at all a surprise, because in a way, older people are even more dispensable from the point of view of this capitalist system, than the children. Not only the daycare are defunded, but there's still some concern for children, because children are the future workers. Well, the elderly are only, a burden on Social Security. We are continuously told Social Security is going to run out. You figure that they would like us to see or die, so they don't have to pay into the Social Security. So really, there's something very fundamental here, something fundamental that even a few billion given to the construction of new daycare centers cannot resolve. It's really a question of rethinking, restructuring, revolutionizing the whole way in which the reproduction of human life is conceived. And here we also need to broaden the spectrum, because when we speak of reproduction, we are speaking, of course, at the center, the question of child raising, the question of the care for the sick. The care for the sick, there are thousands and thousands of women in the United States and all across the world who are prisoners of the home because they have somebody who has a chronic disease and they hardly get any help. Or if they get help today, they have to pay dearly. So it's a picture that is extremely worrisome. But I was saying that we need to broaden the spectrum, because what has become more and more evident, from all the reporting about the causes of COVID, is that the crisis has so many fronts. In the Bronx, for instance, the Bronx in New York has been one of the areas of higher mortality. It's also one of the areas where for many, many years, the quality of the air has been terrible. Children, after a few years of life, develop asthma. Across the world, the quality of air has really so much deteriorated because of industrial exhaust, etc., that some people have seen the sky only because of the lockdown of industry due to the COVID. The quality of the water that we drink. I mean, the Trump administration has practically abolished every laws that restricted, the pollution of our environment. Deforestation, and agriculture that is more and more, industrialized. We eat food that is full of chemical. So when we talk about, pre-existing condition. Pre-existing condition is capitalism. Pre-existing condition is a society where the reproduction of the value of our life is really the last consideration of the system. And, the kind of, to go beyond the crisis that we face and the COVID has dramatized, we need social movement that begin to see the continuity and connect the struggle over many, many, many areas. The home, housework, reproduction, care for the elderly, the question of the environment, relationship to the natural world, forest, water, the seas. We need to connect this struggle because all these struggles are implicated, in the deterioration of the condition of our reproduction. And we cannot only deal with one unless we also deal with the other. And of course, the question of social inequalities. This is very fundamental. Another pre-existing condition is racism in the United States. There is some figures that have come out recently that have been very, very, telling that in the Black community in the US, even people who have a higher level of income compared to the others in the community, right, still have, a life expectancy much lower than white people. And the reason is that regardless of the level of income, the fact of living in a racist society, in a society in which every minute you have to worry because you're Black, living while Black, right, driving while Black, walking in the street while Black, encountering the police while Black. In this kind of society, the tension of everyday life constantly has an effect also on your health and constantly takes away years from your possibilities of survival. So it is a whole spectrum of struggle that we need to engage in, but at the center of it, I think, is something very fundamental, which is the question of, turning upside down the logic that governs the system, the logic that governs our everyday reproduction, turning upside down in the sense that we have to change, the scheme of values, where our life is the bottom, and of course, capitalist profit and accumulation and so on is the ultimate goal, is really all that count, all that matter, and what sets all the priority in social planning, And, this kind of evaluation, we have said in the 70s, we used to say, look at this society, the work and the work that produces death, the arms industry is considered productive, right? Is considered a contributor to the GNP, right? Is considered important for the expansion, etc., etc. The work that reproduces life, it's not. So, raising children, giving life, doing the laborious, incredible work, that the work of reproduction is considered completely unskilled, right? All the knowledges that women have accumulated, dealing with people's emotion, dealing with people's bodies, dealing with people's needs, all that knowledge is considered nothing because it's not knowledge that is associated, with some form of industrial or mechanical, technological production. It's considered part of a natural world. And of course, it's very convenient because if capitalism recognized their work as it is, right, they would not have been able to accumulate the millions and millions they have, because the work is probably the largest sector of work on this planet. And so we need to, in the movements, to really concentrate in terms of figuring out the strategies. But we need to begin to recognize that, first of all, we have to change the whole logic. And which means that I don't think we can go beyond the COVID. We can go beyond unless we always think in whatever action we take, in whatever strategy we devise, in our rises, we don't place a systemic change. And this is what seems to me the most important thing to take away, from our confrontation, with COVID. That we really need a profound systemic change that transform the way we look at the reproduction of our life. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. I think that you have shed a lot of light on what is making this whole pandemic so stressful to everyone. And we see it everywhere. We see the stresses everywhere. And I've always been amazed that why is it that women, housework, I remember 30 years ago, you and I discussing wages for housework. And why is that not counted as part of the GDP? All of the work that goes into getting a man in clean clothes and with a full tummy so that he can go to work and do his job, none of that is counted as work. Yeah. And when we look at the problem of older women who are living on Social Security, and here in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, there are a good number of women from the United States who are widowed or divorced or single, and they're living on $900 a month Social Security. Or $500 a month Social Security, because they never had high-paying jobs, throughout their life, and most of the work that they did was never counted as work or as producing value.
Yeah, exactly. It's considered natural. It's considered housework is considered the same way that capitalism has taken full hands from the natural world. It has taken from women's work. Yeah, it's a continuity with basically what capitalism sees as a natural resource.
Yeah, women are a natural resource, just like oil and gold.
Exactly.
Cliff, do you have some questions? The audience can send questions to Cliff's email, cliff.globaljustice, isn't that right? Here we go. global.justice.cliff@gmail. We have a question from our audience in my house.
The issues of unionizing for the women.
The question for you, Sylvia, is the issues. What are the issues for women in their struggle to unionize?
Well, there's the other question. Maybe I can, if there are two or three, I can look at two or three together, or we can go one by one. If there's some other, maybe otherwise, in terms of unionize, well, there's a lot of organizing that has been taking place by domestic worker, paid domestic worker. This has been now for at the very least 10 years or more, but in the last 10 years, we have really seen more results because the movement have grown and have been able to negotiate some significant changes. And this is a movement that is now international, right? We have a lot in the United States, but also in Europe and other parts of the world, literally in China, in Brazil. And domestic workers, I would say, for the last 2 decades, these are women, mostly migrant, and women who have been displaced literally from their countries that have been recolonized by the World Bank, the IMF, with this massive austerity program, in the name of a debt crisis, artificially engineered. And so, we have seen this mass migration, and it's been very much coordinated, because the moment in which women in the United States, are integrated into the wage workforce, here come, so they have been organizing and placing on the table many of the issues that feminists were discussing in the early 70s. The question of the importance, central strategic importance of reproductive work. The fact that if this work didn't exist, everything would come to a halt. In Spain, there is a movement, Territorio Doméstico Activo, of women, and their slogan is, without us, nothing is moving. And they have been able to negotiate in a number of cases the recognition that they are workers, that they have a right to some pension, they have a right to a fixed number of hours, that they have a right to some vacation. It's more difficult to enforce it because when you have a one-to-one relation, it's becoming much more difficult, right? But the fact that now you have these movements, that they have also a public presence, right? It has been it has made a change. It has certainly changed the legislations. In the US now, several states, not all, but several states recognize that these are work and have the same workers' rights. Generally, domestic workers have been hesitant to turn to the regular unions because often the unions are male-dominated, not completely, but they are, and they don't understand the need, particularly the need that domestic workers have in their forms of organizing. And also these are women who in every aspect of their life now, they're very much controlled by the people they work in, particularly if they are living in the home, where even being able to close the door of your room is a struggle. In many cases, they cannot even turn the key. And at any time of the day or the night, they can knock. Those who employ you can knock and say, oh, can you do this? Or can you do that? People have come, etc. So they're not ready or eager to relinquish the autonomy that they are gaining by coming together, and the strength that they are gaining to coming together, relinquishing by entering into some union federation where their will and their conception of how to move may have to be relinquished to some other leadership, right? So, but the organizing is proceeding, and I think, has been quite effective because now the domestic workers movement is the most visible, most important, movement on the question of reproduction that exists internationally, and there's a lot of collective, who are organizing around the issue of care work and so forth. There's also some criticism that has been mounting, particularly coming from the Black women organization and Black women's writers on the concept of care work, because they rather use a language that stresses labor rights, rather than the question of care. That in a way, distorts in a way the relationship, or places expectation, right? Places expectation that are not placed in any other work relation, And they would rather say this is work. And, care as a whole emotional dimension that in some ways detracts, and I understand where this criticism comes from. We never used that concept, by the way. We always talked about reproduction. And so this is what is happening organizationally now.
Yeah, COVID has brought out the fact that the essential workers, it turns out,
Right.
are
Women.
the lowest paid workers,
Right.
and the people who do, often the most difficult or the most unpleasant kinds of work.
Exactly.
They're the essential workers. And that is something that we can build on.
Yeah.
Cliff, do you have any questions from our
Yes.
viewers?
Yes, we've gotten the first question from a YouTube viewer. Doug Morris asks this: another crucial component in the reproduction and perpetuation of the system of capital is schooling. A majority of elementary school teachers, how has the COVID crisis under the regime of neoliberal capital impacted the lives of women who are elementary teachers?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. The whole issue of essential. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the broadening of the spectrum when we begin to talk about reproductive work, right? And we begin often with the family, etc. But then immediately, because reproductive work is taking place all outside the home as well. Most of the time, when women go to work outside the home, they become daycare workers, nurses, teachers, right? And now, of course, with COVID, this has been recognized that, these are the essential workers, because these are the workers without which really you don't have any other kind of activity. And of course, we should also recognize that house workers are essential workers. Not only the nurses and not only the teachers. They are the. But clearly, the question of schooling it's essential. And my view, and I'm not alone, I think is the hope to see the development of a movement in which, women and men who work in the home, in the family, in the community, and those who are doing the same work or similar work in the institution, like the nurses, like the teacher, come together. Because actually, one of the powers of capitalism, and the United States has perfected this art to a science, is the art of division. And so much investment has been made by the presidents of school, et cetera, in dividing people. So the teachers are told, you see the family, they don't care about the kids, et cetera, right? And the families think, oh, my child doesn't learn anything because the teacher only cares for their paycheck. And the teachers say, oh, the families are expecting everything of us. They don't know how overworked we are, et cetera, right? Whereas the problem is not the teacher, or the problem is not the family. The problem is the way the organization of the schooling, and the fact that parents don't have time to really follow up what's happening with the children, with the fact that the teachers have too many classes, too many students, etc. Same with the nurses. Anything that goes wrong in an hospital, everything that goes wrong, a medicine that is given at the wrong moment, etc., is the fault of the nurses. And I've read enough reports to know that all racist excuses are used. And so pitting the families of the patients, against the nurses and vice versa, And, meanwhile, the number of staff in hospitals has continuously been reduced, and I think, imagine also New York. New York in the last 20 years, they have abolished 19 hospitals, public hospitals. This gives you an idea of the value that this society places on healthcare. So I think
And
that
it's not,
part of the building of new movement, part of dealing is also going beyond refusing this way in which people are being divided. And I think that we need to have the creation of spaces in which, people from the nurses and from the community come together, because we also need to have some control on the services that the government sets up. When we ask for more services, we also should ask for the possibility of having more saying, more control, more presence. For instance, everybody knows that when you go to the hospitals, there's a lot of anxiety about how you're going to be treated. And for instance, in the Black women in particular, when they go to give birth these days, many of them want to go with another woman, with a doula, because they have a whole history of being treated in a way that is humiliating. In a way, it's not an accident, for instance, that the infant mortality, the number of women who have problems in giving birth is so much higher. It's because of all the prejudices and so on that come in when a woman goes to give birth to a hospital. So now, many of them will go with a doula, with a woman whose role is to enable you to concentrate on the act of giving birth rather than having to fight with the doctor. And I think that kind of alliance between the community, people in the community and people working in the institution, which is the same, in two different roles. It's really strategically fundamental.
We have some
it's
additional
not a
questions.
coincidence.
Sure.
No, we have some additional questions that have come in from YouTube viewers.
And Gregory has a
Right.
question.
Let me,
Sure.
while I have the opportunity, let me put them up on the screen and you can deal with them. This comes from Laura Yola. Can you comment on the Zapatista women going to Europe at this time of COVID? And then a second viewer question comes from Laura Carlson. As far as solutions, you've indicated that more services are not enough. Do you
Yeah.
think permanent basic income, like the $1,200 temporary payment now in the US, is enough? Could there, let me see. Could income directly come directly to women primary caregivers? And then a third viewer question is from Vicky Leone. Could you discuss current thinking about what ties together the three hidden abodes that stand invisibly behind exploitation in the workforce? Expropriation of women, of nature, and of the neo-colonies. What should we be reading to follow this discussion in your own work and the work of others? Thank you so much for your important thought. There's a lot to do.
Yeah. And okay, so I don't think you should ask the Zapatista women. You shouldn't ask me. I'm not going to comment about the Zapatista women going to Europe, really. And I know there's a great excitement. I can say there's huge excitement in Europe for the coming of the Zapatistas. Very much. I talked to some. That's all I can say. No, more services are not enough. Monetary support is great, but the basic income have a lot of problems. And that too is not enough. I think I stress that we really need a systemic change, right? Obviously, a systemic change begins with small steps. It's not necessarily, but so again, it's like the question of the form of revolution, right? I think that that's a false contrast. It's obviously revolution does not occur in one day, but the question is what kind of reform, right? There are certain reforms that are giving more power to everybody. They're lifting the bottom. Those are good reforms. It means the struggle is not over, but you have more means. You have better relation to work with, right? There are other reforms that are dividing people. They are satisfying the needs of one sector, they are ignoring the other. Those reforms have to be rejected. They have to be rejected because, in fact, they seem to answer some needs, but in the end, they divide people. I would say the same thing in terms of the services. I think that, yes, we need services. Right now, we don't have the means because much of the wealth on the earth is in the hand of capital and the state. So obviously, our struggle, the center, the support of our struggle must be a process of reappropriation of the wealth. How do we reappropriate it? How do we reappropriate? And with the wealth, the control also, over production, the control over work. What is being produced? For whom? For what? That is what we need. So services, yes, the struggle for services is important. But I think we have to be skeptical of a struggle that says, okay, the state, we want more services from the state. We also have to introduce elements of control on what kind of services. How do we want it to be organized? We have to, for instance, we know that the healthcare that today the majority of us receive, the majority of working class people receive, it's really healthcare that is finalized to sending us back to work as quick as possible. The first thing you do when you go bleeding to a hospital is to, okay, what is your insurance? What is your this? What is your that? And so many of the practices, right, also have to do not really with ensuring that you're really a healthy person. Has to insurance that they can patch you back together as quick as possible so you can go back to work. So that we need to organize services yet, but also what kind of services. This is where, the coming together, the sharing of a terrain and common ground between people who are in the family, the community, and people who are working within the institution. They need us for their struggle, and we need them for the struggle. I think we cannot have, for example, a struggle over healthcare services unless we have this kind of alliance, unless we are able. This is clearly not simple. For instance, if everybody is overworked and working 24 hours a day, there is no time to come together and discuss. So the struggle has many sides. The reduction of the work time, liberating some of our time, liberating space so that we can have places where we can come together with the mask and free mask and full mask and the distances, whatever it is, where we come together, or the Zoom. This is what I'm talking about. And fundamentally also, exactly what is the long-term horizon? Every struggle has to have a long-term horizon. We cannot simply think of a struggle isolated from the rest. The struggle has to have a long-term horizon. This applies to the basic income. I'm very problematic with the basic income. Milton Friedman, was one of the first to support the idea of a basic income. Milton Friedman, like many neoliberal economists, was supporting with the idea of send them a check, probably very small, and then the government gets out of the business of supporting any reproduction, gets out of the business of Social Security, pension, right? So we have to be very careful What do we mean by basic income? Because there are many conceptions of basic income. I'm also worried that the notion of basic income is very, universal and doesn't really, for many people, in Europe, Marxist autonomists speak of income without work. No, it's not income without work. I think it's very important to put on the plate all the work that we are doing for them. I think it's important. The great contribution, I think, of the Wages for Household movement was to say, our children, our husbands, our families are not really, they look like the beneficiaries of this work. But the real beneficiary are the employers who are exploiting them. They are the real beneficiary. And so was to put on the table all this work that the capitalist class has gained for nothing or for very little, right? And I think my fear about some version of the basic income is that this is becoming concealed again, that this is becoming, papered over again. No?
Bob, do you want to ask
Yes,
a
I do.
question? Bob has a question.
Sure.
Sylvia,
Hello, Bob. Yes.
hello, my dear. What do you think of the following proposal as the beginning of a way of thinking about the profound revolution you're proposing?
Yes.
Much more profound than any conceived of. He
Mhm.
covered the partial exploitation of workers who don't get the surplus value they create. You're speaking of the devalued labor of all labor by women.
Mhm.
So if he were alive now, you would be him.
Mhm.
Now, what I want to ask is this: what is the product of reproductive labor versus productive labor? Productive labor produces commodities,
Right.
whose sale produces capital. So the goal of production is capital. It's not humans. The
Right.
goal of reproductive labor is humans,
Right.
women and men who teach and are in the helping professions produce human beings.
Right.
But that's devalued in relation to
Right.
capital.
Right.
So I'm asking, instead of reproductive labor being an adjunct of productive labor, something that you pay for with the wage, you allow a worker to reproduce himself in his home. It's covered by the wage, and it's an adjunct to reproduction. Is an adjunct to production.
Mhm.
Production should be an adjunct to reproduction.
Right. No, I think actually, Bob, I think that there is now a feminism that is growing, and especially in Latin America, that is looking at reproduction in a way, along the way in which we did, but connecting it also beyond with the ecological movement and so on, that is looking at reproduction not as a complement to production or not as a separate sector, right? But as a different way of looking at capitalism. And looking at capitalism in from reproduction is the big category, is the fundamental category, because we cannot think of the reproduction of the system, right? So that is, and because, this idea, I think you're right, this idea of production here, reproduction there, and these two different sectors doesn't make any sense. And so when we speak of reproduction, is also speaking of production. For instance, when you take the point of view of reproduction, then you ask yourself, why should we produce chemicals that are killing people? Bringing the issue of reproduction, for instance, to the question of what is being produced in this society. Why producing chemical, etc., that are now giving us this most horrible cancer that are destroying, and they are completely useless. I mean, I've been in Mexico and I visited places, north of Puebla. What is the state north of Puebla? Where they have this agricultural experiment from, people from below who are growing, for instance, without any kind of chemical, by going back to the traditional system where you plant certain plants together with others, making sure that the insects will not eat the coffee, will not eat the beans, because they will have their plants to eat from. Traditionally, they knew how to deal with insects. They knew how to deal with pests. They knew how to enrich the soil with nitrogen, right? They didn't need all these fertilizers and all this chemical input. They cost a lot of money and destroying our bodies and really destroying the earth. Marx was right. Capitalist agriculture tires the earth as it tires the bodies of the worker, right? So they knew, and now many people are reappropriating this older system. And what did they find? Tabasco state, right? Am I correct?
Tabasco is not north of Puebla. Maybe, are you thinking about Veracruz, perhaps?
No. But it doesn't matter. In any case, it's a place north of Puebla, of the Puebla state, and we visited this thing, and they showed to us that actually when they went back to this traditional method, and I'm using this example, but there are many, many others, they actually doubled their output. They actually doubled their output, So we really need to rethink because this the way capitalist production now is, it's really thanatocracy. It's really death producing. And if we look at everything, including what goes on an assembly line, of what goes on a market, from the point of view of the reproduction of human life, so many activities, so many companies would have to be shut down because they are really producers of death. And I think that this is the kind of change that needs to occur, because we see now that everywhere is a catastrophe. COVID is one of the many catastrophes, but everywhere is a catastrophe, ecological, etc. So this system is killing us. And, obviously it's killing some population and some groups in the population much more than others. But it's a system that is now really hell-bent. We haven't even spoken about war. So I think that, to me, the question is, again, to see the continuity of struggle, build movements that express organizationally that continuity, movements that, as they say in Spain or in Argentina, place life at the center, ponen la vita al centro, see? And, that means to relook at the whole. That means, and obviously none of us can be working present on all these fronts, but we all have to see the continuity about the struggle that we are making. If we are struggling as nurses in a hospital, or as a domestic worker, or as teachers, we need to see the continuity with the other struggles.
Gregory Diamant has been waiting with a comment.
Oh, sorry.
No, yes. I mean, there seems to be a great tension between solidarity and misogyny. And we see that so often. And Sylvia, you referenced that in the fear of a lot of women of dealing with traditional unions because of the misogynistic or patriarchal attitude.
Mhm.
And I won't call this irony, but just this morning, I read that the head of the Republican Party in Michigan said of the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, that she needs to be burned at the stake.
Oh,
And
no.
yes, you can read about it. I just read it this morning. And other Republicans said other similar kinds of things. Of course, it made me think of your book of,
Yeah.
so many years ago, Caliban and the Witch. But this has been a problem in the left for a long time in terms of organizing. And I think we've all faced it and dealt with it in one way or another over the past, 40 or 50 years that we've been involved. So it's a great concern, and it's very good that so many of these organizations like Black Lives Matter and so forth are organized and seem to be led by women and challenging a lot of these things. But this, I don't know if you want to comment on it, but this whole question of this tension between misogyny and solidarity is one, I think, of concern and has to be dealt with on many levels.
Yeah, I agree. I didn't know, this. It's very interesting, because, oh my God, there's so much to say. Well, first of all, there's been, for the last 3 decades, there's been a return of witch hunting in most of the world. And it's really come at the hands, in particular, 2 phenomena, like in Africa, India, Papua New Guinea, you now have a lot of killing, mostly of women, and accused again of being witches. And there are certainly 2 factors that stand out. I cannot go in detail, but one is capitalist relation, for example, affecting land property, the destruction of communal land relation, and the shrinking of land. So women inherit land, the next they are accused of being witches. So the whole land issue, which is murderous now, because everybody's trying to appropriate land in Africa, etc., companies. The other is the spread of these Pentecostal, Christian fundamentalist sects that come from the United States. And then they have begun to talk again about the devil and telling people that they are poor because the devil is in their midst, right? And so it's very interesting that this Republican, because this Christian fundamentalist, really the center is here in the US. They are now accusing this, Michigan governor, my God. Anyway, so yeah, misogyny, I think, is one of the big problems. Racism and misogyny is in the movement are really a big issue. One of the issues that so many women ask me when I go and talk to people is, what do you do when the rapist is a comrade? And there's now a number of articles that are coming out from different places on this issue. And recently in Colombia, for example, a woman, an activist and so on. So the issue is very, very strong. And, this now, of course, even accentuated because of the increase of violence that has been produced by COVID, not only because women are locked down, but being locked down, there's less possibility of getting support, of being able to leave the places in which they are being abused. And it's tragic when also this happens, in environments, in movements.
It's not a coincidence that the essential workers teachers and nurses have been attacked over the last 20 years because they're highly unionized, they're well paid, they have some control over their work conditions, and people are now seeing, oh my goodness, it's a lot of work teaching kids. And people are beginning to value the work of teaching. And of course, they see the work of nursing. But something on a slightly different topic that I wanted to ask you about is the World Economic Forum people have been talking about the Great Reset and how they're going to use the current catastrophe and crisis as a way of rearranging or more of the function. But obviously there are people unhappy all around the world, and people are demanding that they have more care, more food. But the elites are preparing a response to that, to the growing discontent around the world. And the Great Reset, they call it. And I was wondering, what are you thinking about that? How are you thinking about that today? How do you see that?
Yeah, no, I'm very, very scary. I want to say something about teaching first, because I think that the teachers union have actually been a kind of a model. You know, I think that the teachers, the nurses and the teachers, in terms of, you know, workers' organizations, have been really among the most radical. And I'm thinking about the nurses. The nurses have been present in so many places. You know, Come Occupy, the nurses are out there, so many places. Teachers, I mean, they have begun more and more to look at their children, not only in terms of the work that they do in school, which, you know, has been a disaster area from the kind of program that have been imposed on them, but also in terms of the fact that many of them are malnourished. You know, the teachers have been denouncing the fact that children are not paying attention in the United States, not because they are not interested, but because they are hungry. Many of them have begun to bring food to school. And when they've gone on strike, one of the latest strike, they would make tables so that their students would still be able to have the food, even though the classrooms were not taking place. So this has been the kind of breaking down that isolation, because there's been a serious problem with trade union in the United States, which really goes back to the New Deal. Because before the New Deal, working class organizations were not just limited to the workplace, you know, very, very defined in limited way. Working class organizations looked at the life of the worker as a whole. You know, they were very rooted in the community. And often when workers went on strike, the whole community, you know. So, you know, the teachers had begun to break down that you know, the home and the workplace. And that, I think, is important. About the World Economic Forum, my God, what to say? Yeah, the world reset, of course. Capitalism has been now for many years, you know, saying that their profit level is not enough. You know, so they, you know, they have been complaining. And you can see, for instance, the fact that the interest rate on the dollar, on the borrowing of the dollar, is being zero. That historically has been a kind of anomaly, right? That means that they are not satisfied with the rate of profit that they are receiving, right? And secondly, you know, the fact that zero growth, right? They are the ones who are proposing a kind of very, very, you know, low level of growth. And these are all, to me, example of the fact that the capitalists are kind of basically going into a sort of strike. And the reset means they're going to use the COVID as much as they can to reorganize work, reorganize production, push a lot of people back into the home, make women take on more of the work of reproduction, unload on workers in general, men and women, the cost of production. If you're working at home, there's a lot of overhead the companies can save. Schools, already we hear a lot of universities saying that, oh, you know, many of these classes, they can be done by Zoom. Not all classes are going to go back to a physical space. So this is very, 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 clearly on the agenda. And we need to deal with that, because true, I think across the world is one big struggle. People are at the edge of their survival and people are fighting back. Everywhere there is a struggle. And so now everywhere you see war, you see basically, this kind of response. And the reset, it's like the new program that we need to confront.
I wonder if I can take you back to the discussion of President Biden's infrastructure ideas.
Yes, right.
I mean, what is striking is that infrastructure is now coming to be understood not just as physical infrastructure, a built environment, but human infrastructure, caregiving is coming to be seen as one of the things that is needed for the reproduction of society. And the important thing is that is to be supported by public funds, not just privately. Like for example, we've long recognized there's a need for recreation. And so there's been public support for parks and pools and the like, even sports stadiums, because that provides the kind of recreation that is needed in the society to be supported by public funds. So conceptually, I think we're seeing a very important step forward in the public discourse when caregiving is spoken of as part of the human infrastructure to be supported by the public funds.
Right. But we'll see, because I don't know how far it goes. My understanding is that what he said in Pittsburgh is that the money will go to constructing daycare centers and refurbishing those existing. I haven't heard anything, for instance, about senior people, about home care for the sick. There's a lot of things I haven't heard, in that talk about care, the care economy. And that is a huge, huge, huge step, because now you have a elderly population, and we have seen what has happened in the nursing home, and we have seen the disaster of the last 20 years when home service, there is a whole category called home service, social workers going to the homes, has been decimated. And I haven't heard that issue addressed. Similarly, the whole story of women who have taken care of chronic diseases at home, incredible. There's so many. That's another thing. The level of health in the population has collapsed. You have a lot of younger people with chronic ailments that didn't exist in the past. And so now that too has to be addressed. So, and we heard that it is going to increase tax credits. Well, tax credits also benefit people who have a regular employment, right? There's a lot of people have been excluded, particularly migrant workers, etc. They have been excluded from tax credits. So in other words, yes, there are issues, and it's good that now people speak of care. It's very good that now people are discovering that reproduction is a huge problem. Because now there's a lot of women who are screaming, who are really going crazy. And the way it has been done also, the schools in New York now, the schools open for 2 weeks, then they close down, then they open, and these poor mothers, they don't know what to do, no? And dealing also with the traumas, the emotional work. So it's good that it's here, but I don't see yet the kind of real systemic rethinking of what care work means in the long run. But yeah, not at least at the institutional level. Not
Another thing that we've heard recently that is new is on PBS, which is mainstream news. You'll hear that Congress is not voting for what the great majority of people want. Right. Now, we've known that this has been true for forever, but they're actually now starting to say it.
Right.
And that is something that's quite new.
Yeah.
As well as the emphasis on, oh, gee, all of these essential workers. Oh, gee, the problems that women and children are having.
Yes.
So a lot of things that have been unsaid are starting to be said. And that's positive.
Absolutely.
But it's just
barely. The issue of reproduction is in the spotlight. The issue of housework, reproductive work, etc., is in the spotlight. No question. No question about it. Yes. And the violence. Yeah.
And thanks in large part to the work of Sylvia Federici, who there was an article in the New York Times Magazine about Sylvia on February 17th. And the author of the article mentions that all of a sudden Sylvia Federici is being quoted everywhere. So needless to say, having been through years and years of anti-IMF, anti-World Bank panels at conferences with you, Sylvia, I'm very happy to see that you're getting the recognition that that you deserve. We'll put on our webpage Sylvia's impressive list of publications so that our public can check it out and start looking up the other works of Sylvia's. We've mentioned Caliban and the Witch, but there's a whole list of things that she's been doing over all these years. And I wonder if there are other questions or.
Yes. I first of all like to point out that the link to the New York Times Magazine article on Sylvia is on our website in the description for this webinar. At the end of that description, you'll find the URL. Also, let me call your attention to the fact that in the chat box, Marin Stange has posed a question, but I see she's in the Zoom room, and maybe Marin wants to present her question directly herself.
Oh, can you hear me? Can you see me? Okay, hi.
Yeah.
Well, I wrote it out. I as I said there, and as Sylvia continued to talk after the question, an earlier question mentioned attention and solidarity. between misogyny and solidarity. I guess I wanted to kind of scale it up to a contradiction that it remains unresolved in any kind of male-dominated leftist thinking. I'm not saying every single moment of leftist thinking is male-dominated, because it's very hard for men to give up the privileges they receive, they enjoy, because and many different kinds of privileges, economic not the least, and both on the personal and the structural workplace even levels, other levels. It's very hard for them to well, they don't want to, there's a tendency to hold on to those, which interferes with a possibility. They're contributing more to possibilities of imagining and then moving toward restructuring all sorts of things, obviously, society and work and so on, so that this is not unpaid labor, which or low paid labor, which can be so easily sort of attributed or tagged to women as the natural. So it's really look at those cute teacher gals taking money out of their low salaries because they're so worried about their kids not being fed. Well, I guess that solves that problem. So I don't know. I guess my question is, can we find a more exact language to talk about the situation that was raised originally as attention in solidarity? Misogyny creates attention in solidarity. Are there other ways of talking about this situation? Perhaps calling it a contradiction.
Oh, I was talking about the teachers bringing the food for the children, not in relation to the question of misogyny. I was thinking about the fact that I saw as a step, and of course,
I realize that.
Yeah, it's not a solution, but it's a step in the sense that, I want to say something because, I know you recognize it, but it's an important, over the last 10, 15 years, I've noticed that, concrete situation have a way of forcing things when something is real. And it's a way. And what has happened with the teachers that they were forced to bring the food to school, I've also seen with nurses. I was in a conference in Philadelphia not long ago called Rebel Nurses. Rebel nurses, these are nurses, rebel nurses. Yeah, they realized something. These were women working in hospitals and so on, in clinics. They realized that a phenomenon they kept seeing. They kept seeing these guys coming into the hospital, usually poor people, old men, old women, poor, coming into the hospital. They're sick, they get better, they go out, they come back after a week, sick again, they come back, it's like this. And they realize these people go out, they don't have anybody helping them with their pills, nobody giving them some good food. And they began to say, what are we doing? What is that we are doing? And we need to go into the community. They were beginning to come together to realize that a lot of what was taking place in the hospital was in a way useless because the people did not have a supportive structure in the community. And they realized if what we do has any meaning, we have to begin to think of connecting with the community, of some infrastructure. And that's what the conference was about. How do we think what would be necessary, given the way things are, that could make a difference? Now, to me, that is a very important step. It's a step that because the great power of capitalism at so many levels has been to divide us into different blocks. so that everybody seems to have a different interest. I work in my hospital, I fight around my hospital, you are in the community, I fight about, and we need to break down the walls. We need to break down those walls and make those connections, create common grounds, because some of the problems cannot be solved in the place where they are emerging. They have to be solved in a broader context. And I think that this is a very, very important issue. And what the teachers are doing, bringing the food, it's a way of breaking down, going out of what the school is supposed to do. The nurse is going at, and I think also the question of misogyny. It's a issue of really, you know, what does it mean to work in a place? You know, what are the relationships, right? And I think it's that kind of reasoning, it's the kind of activism that I think that we need, right? Those connections that have to be made that I think are really important.
I completely agree. I didn't mean to
disparage.
I know. I was parroting an imaginary hardcore misogynist, and maybe I didn't do a very good job for some reason. Yeah, but yeah.
It sounds like the issue
Are there other?
of,
yeah.
The issue of the misogyny, the separation and artificial boundaries, these walls between us, people are increasingly experiencing alienation on a physical as well as an emotional level.
Yeah.
I sometimes think I won't know how to be a friend anymore by the time I get out of the house.
Yeah, this way they're scaring us, eh? The COVID teaching distrust in the other person, anger, you know, you're coming close, fear, it's perfect, and we really have to be very aware of this, very aware. And also, I want to say something before we close, which is the way the vaccine is now talked about. The vaccine is talked about like the Holy Grail. It's the Holy Grail, you know, it's like the miracle. It's like the Holy Grail. I mean, I don't know. Okay, no, it's like the miracle cure for everything. Get vaccinated and all will be resolved. No talk about chemical agriculture. No talk about, you know, air polluted that destroys your lungs. No talk about the fact that we have 15 types of chemicals in the water that we drink. Get vaccinated, right? Until the next vaccine. And now they're telling us that the vaccine may not last more than 6 months. They're now finally saying that every 6 months we'll have to be vaccinated again. Yeah? That this is all they can guarantee. They are beginning to say it now. At first it seemed it was a lifetime. Then it was 1 year. Now they're saying 6 months. You know? But the worst thing is that the vaccine. No therapy. Have you heard of it? Nothing is said about therapy. So in Italy, for instance, my sister tells me that there are doctors who are actually saying, no, there are therapies. We are actually treating people with this and that. But there's no talk about therapies. And this, I find it very typical. The pharmaceutical companies will be billions and billions. If you say anything, you're treated like a Trump supporter. Everything, if you say anything about the vaccine, you're a Trump supporter, right? But the reality is that there's no discussion about all these other areas of the reproductive crisis that is destroying our bodies, that is lowering our immunity, that the number of people who die of cancer every year, clearly of avoidable cancers, clearly due to environmental conditions, is higher than the number of people, who die of COVID. No mention of those who die of cancer. No mention in the United States of the 40,000, 50,000 a year who died of suicide. Suicide, right? And I mean, and what happened to the flu? People are not dying of the flu any longer, it seems. The flu has disappeared. All of a sudden, COVID has dealt with the flu. We used to hear that 20,000 people, 15,000, 10,000 were dying of the flu. The flu has disappeared, right? And so, I don't know, I suggest that a good dose of, reflection and skepticism too, we'll have to be all vaccinated because otherwise it will become impossible to do anything. But I also resent the fact that this has now been presented as one and all cure, even though it might last only for 6 months. And every 6 months we might get another 2 doses and another 2 doses. Yes, so yeah, this is...
Well, thank you so much, Sylvia, and thank you for mentioning the problems of industrial agriculture, which is actually the topic that we're going to be discussing next Monday. But I would like to give you a big hand and thank you so much for sharing all of this with us.
Well,
and
it's been a great pleasure to see you all.
Wonderful. Oh, well, it's been a great pleasure for us. And we're so happy that you could join us today, and thank you. And I hope we'll see you soon. And I want to thank all of our guests and who have joined us. And I hope that everyone has enjoyed this as much as we here at my house have today. Today's webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, and they're also accessible from the Global Justice Center website. And for next week, we will have, that's this week, next week,
Dominguez and
the problem of industrial agriculture with Ercelia Soares and Oscar Ugertek. So every Monday we have these webinars, and I want to thank the whole team who puts on the webinars: Liz Mestris, Gregory Diamond, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales, Bob Stone, and Cliff Duran, and most especially our speaker, Sylvia. And please check out her article, which is on our webpage and at the bottom of the announcement of her talk. And thank you once again, Sylvia. Thank you for bringing this whole discussion and helping us make sense of what is happening to our world and how we can think about improving it and bringing it all together. Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you to you all, and much love to you all, and stay well. You love. Bye, Bye, Lisa.
Yeah,
Bye.
yeah.
Bye, Cliff.
And much love to George too.
Yes, I will.
Okay.
Big hug to you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. That's all for today. Thank you.
personal comment. It said when you go to the